In 1890, it was not at all obvious that the cowboy would become the dominant American hero of the first 3/4 of the 20th century. The long drive lingered only in the memories of a few old cowhands. Mennonites now populated the Dakotas. Professional farmers had taken over the Kansas prairies. There was still a cattle industry, but the cowboy was now an employee of a corporation. He wasn't the free cowpoke of old. Meanwhile, Native Americans had been confined to reservations. Now, more than a century has passed since the disappearance of the actual woolly cowboy, but we have a phenomenon unique in all of American mythology. Western songs still play on the airwaves. The rodeo is still going strong over in the Astrodome, that big barn. Cowboy novels still crowd the shelves of drugstores and groceries. Nearly every little boy still demands a Western six-shooter cap pistol. And cowboys still gaze at you from cigarette advertisements. So old people who thought that cowboy movies were just a passing craze when they starred Tom Mix or William S. Hart lived to see Hopalong Cassidy and the Lone Ranger, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, not to mention John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and Clint Eastwood. It would go on and on and on. And that never happened with any other American mythology. What should we make of this? Why didn't similar myths develop about the roustabouts who built up the Texas oil industry? Why didn't similar myths develop about the lumberjacks who cleared timber? Why didn't similar myths develop about the builders of the railroads? I mean, those too were pretty dramatic stories. Why did only this one story persist? What do you think? I mean, there's lots of interesting episodes in American history, but only one of them seems to survive.
Well, the other ones aren't anywhere near as romantic or heroic as being a cowboy.
Whaling boats? Come on, a harpoon between a man and a whale. The whale could, destroy your boat. Doesn't that seem dramatic? No, I'm just teasing, needless to say, but why not?
Just because you're not saving the damsel in distress, when you're laying down the tracks, you're spreading out the country, but you're not really saving anybody.
That's interesting. Other thoughts? I mean, why this hero? Yes.
Law versus lawlessness, which is a fundamental part of the American psyche.
Okay, so it's not just about the cowboy, right? It's really about larger issues than the cowboy. It has to do with gender, it has to do with law and order, it has to do with this threatening other that needs to be overcome. So the cowboy is a vehicle for getting at these other themes. Little boys don't dress up like Paul Bunyan. Harpooners do not appear on Wheaties packages. Yet these episodes were just as colorful and lasted longer than the story of the cowboy. But they would be forgotten and the cowboy would live on. Because beginning in the 1890s, the western frontier became mythic space. I would defy you here in Houston to find that west, right? Yet anyone who comes to visit, they think they're coming to Houston, there's going to be cowboys in the streets. And they literally believe it on some level because we inhabit mythic ground, even though the reality is that this looks like Boston or Philadelphia. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was the most popular commercial entertainment in America from 1883 to 1916. And it helped to transform the West into this symbolic environment. And then in 1902, a Philadelphia lawyer, educated at Harvard, never been west of the Mississippi River, a man named Owen Wister published a novel called The Virginian that would define the cowboy hero for the next half century. Now, Buffalo Bill's an interesting guy. Buffalo Bill had been a trapper, soldier, a Pony Express rider, an Army scout, and a buffalo hunter. He also claimed that he was the first American soldier to avenge the death of George Armstrong Custer by killing an Indian and scalping him. And so he would always hold up this scalp as the first scalp for Custer. Kind of ugly. And it would be Buffalo Bill who would demonstrate the tremendous popular appeal of the Western. But it truly was Owen Wister who would define the nature of the Western hero. Owen Wister established the modern Western hero myth. And if you ever read The Virginian, it'll sound awfully familiar because it's been ravaged by plagiarists and imitators, and its plot devices have been used again and again and again. Literally hundreds of books and films are modeled on The Virginian. The movie High Noon simply reenacts the plot of The Virginian, telling the story of the hero who rejects his heroine's pleas in order to uphold his honor against a villain named Trampas. Of course, the West of The Virginian is anything but the realistic West. Owen Wister had never been to the real West, so reality didn't get in the way of his depiction of the West. The authentic cowboy drove cattle. The authentic cowboy worked for a living. There was monotony on the plains. There was incredible loneliness on the plains. The Virginian runs errands now and then, but there are no cattle drives. There's no monotony. There's no hard work. Fictional cowboys are never bored. Real-life cowboys were so bored that they memorized the labels on tin cans and then played games to see who could remember them better than the other. It was a terrible life. The cowboys in the movies are much too busy chasing bandits to work at such dreary tasks as driving cattle. Western landscapes can be bleak, but they're never dull in cowboy stories. The West is the land of the unexpected. The West is a land of surprise. The West is a land of variety. It is an environment of uncertainty. It's an environment of change. And men of true genius stand out in this moral jungle. The evil or the good in each individual's personality is quickly revealed out in cowboy land. So it's a mythic place that everything can be projected onto. Now, of course, the West of the imagination is a male-only world. The Western hero is happiest with a group of buddies playing poker, chasing horse thieves, and riding in masculine company. Does this sound like anything to you? This kind of vision? The boys' gang, playing cards, chasing after things that remind you of anything? What age group sounds most like that? Pre-adolescent boys, right? I mean, this is what a Western's really about. The Western hero is contemptuous of farmers. He has little interest in children, little children. He considers men who live among women effete. He's left his family at a tender age because he's rebelled against the restrictions of mothers and older sisters. He's out on his own, just like a pre-adolescent fantasizes, right? Yet in story after story, the hero courts a young school teacher from Vermont or some other tender woman from the East. What's the role of this woman? Is she going to be a hero? Though Grace Kelly does okay in High Noon, as we saw earlier. What's her role in the Western? Yeah, press your button, please. I'm sorry.
To be in distress.
To be in distress, to be rescued. And she also serves to reveal certain qualities in our hero that we wouldn't know otherwise. There were few women in the west of the Chisholm Trail, and those few in Dodge City or Abilene or Wichita were of dubious morality. They weren't Quaker school teachers from Vermont. The cowboy's sex life was intermittent, to say the least. The cowboy had to carry his thirst long distances, like the camel, and in the oases, the orgies were not on a spiritual plane, like in High Noon. Women play a special role in the Western. They serve to throw a strong light on the hero, to make him stand out in relief, to complete the picture of our hero as an ideal. In the first place, she brings out qualities we would not otherwise see. We see that he is tender. We see that he has a conscience. These are downplayed in his relations with the guys. But it's not just the woman who brings this out. It's also his horse. A cowboy's tenderness is always revealed in how he treats his horse. And the Eastern belle is treated as if she is a sort of glorified horse. A woman is someone to rescue. A woman is someone to protect. So part of the ideology of Westerns, part of what makes Westerns so unattractive generally to people today, is the treatment of women in them, which is a very much an intrinsic part of the way Westerns work. So a cowboy in books like The Virginian is the hero of the pre-adolescent male. That is, of course, if you were watching the psychology course that precedes this one, is a stage of revolt against femininity. It's a stage of revolt against feminine standards. It's an age of hero worship. So culturally, the cowboy truly is the hero of the pre-adolescent boy. Our cowboy hero summed up this attitude in terms that would appeal to most 10-year-old boys. Quote, "I'd as soon fight a she-lion bare-handed as have any trunk with a gale." The usual cowboy hero has as much social presence in front of the leading lady as a very bashful boy. You saw Gary Cooper a little earlier. Now, religion doesn't have much place in Westerns. The hero of the Western mythology is too much of a god himself to be very religious. Indeed, he's free of family conflicts. He's free of smoldering hatreds. He's free from entangled jealousies and loves. And therefore, he's not very concerned about sin or guilt. He doesn't know what they mean. They're just not part of the world that he inhabits. Yet, despite his violent conflicts, the cowboy is essentially innocent. His life has a basically innocent quality to it. Even when witnessing a murder, the cowboy is removed further from sin than the farmer in a squalid frontier town tied down by a family. He is not just footloose and fancy, free of family entanglements. He's also free of religion. He's free of preoccupations with sin. Of course, the cowboy is not positively anti-religious. He's a respecter of traditions, at least as long as those traditions don't threaten his freedom. So the Virginian hero listens to a long sermon, but what he can't stand is not the sermon. It's the raging about man's evil nature, because he knows that he's good, and he knows that his cowboy friends are good. It's just the evil people who are evil. And again, this is part of this ideology of the Western, that there's good guys on one side and there's bad guys on the other. It's not a picture of moral ambiguity. Now, the cowboy loves the beauty of the natural world. He has too much horse sense to be deluded by theological brooding. And here's what a real cowboy said of his mother's death. With almost her last breath, she begged me to make my peace with God, while the making was good. I've been too busy to heed her last advice. Being a just God, I feel that He will overlook my neglect. If not, I will have to take my medicine with Satan holding the spoon. So while the cowboy is not anti-religious, he's just not obsessed with theology or the concerns with sin and evil that so preoccupy the rest of American society. So another pre-adolescent trait, I think. Now, the cowboy hero has respect for property, but he doesn't seek personal wealth. Indeed, one of the themes of the cowboy epics is that a cowboy is generous to the point of carelessness. He gives money to his friends, he gives money to people in distress, and whatever money he has left, he blows on Saturday night. He owns no land, and he has only contempt for farmers with their plowed lands. He is truly free and uncommitted. He hates people who are obsessed with money. He hates the sick, slick professional gambler. He hates the grasping Eastern speculator. He hates the railroad man because money doesn't matter to him. He has but one possession, and that possession, of course, is his horse. His horse is his connection with the medieval knight. And so a horse thief is the ultimate symbol of evil, because a horse thief is stealing another man's steed. When a cowboy is willing to sell his horse, as one actually does in the Virginian, he has sold not just a horse, he's sold his dignity and he's sold his identity. And selling your horse always turns into a tragic error. Yet despite his fine horse, despite his expensive saddle and boots, the cowboy is not an ambitious man. The cowboy just isn't concerned with hard work. He isn't a Yankee. He's a Westerner instead. He values his code of honor. He values his friends. He values this much more than he values his possessions. He fights for law and order, but he doesn't have any desire to settle down. He wants to remain free. So the cowboy hero is easygoing and informal. And so what I'd like to suggest to you is that the cowboy hero helped define a new ideal of masculinity. The cowboy hero was informal in dress, in speech, in manner. He's no Victorian, right? He does not wear a proper suit coat. He is a very different image of masculinity. Villains are invariably tense. Villains are nervous, but the cowboy knows how to relax. He sits placidly at a card game, never ruffled, never disturbed, even when his arch rival is behind him at the bar, hot with rage and whiskey. He remains invariably calm and collected. The real cowboy is the kind of man who turns around slowly when a pistol goes off and drawls, "I'd put that up if I were you," sounding a bit like Nolan Ryan. But he's also like a young tomcat, calm and relaxed, but ready to spring into action. The most famous line in The Virginian is, "Smile when you call me that." Of course, cowboy movies bristle with violence. They're filled with fist fights, brawls with chairs and bottles, gunplay, battles with windows, and a final skirmish on horseback. These are characteristic parts of the cowboy dramas as much as horses, boots, and spurs. The explanation is that they provide a stage for the cowboy to prove his heroism. To a 10-year-old boy, physical prowess is the most important thing, certainly not having a college degree. Pre-adolescent boys are constantly plagued by fear, by doubt, by insecurity, and they lack the power to crush all this. The ethics of the cowboy are the ethics of the boys' gang, where each member has his role determined by his physical skills. So the cowboy movie really does, I think, appeal to this pre-adolescent psychology that I'm afraid is in all of us. Perhaps, of course, the most outstanding cowboy trait, even above honor, courage, and generosity, is the cowboy's relaxed, calm attitude towards life. He lives intensely, to be sure. He has a calm self-assurance, a knowledge that he can handle anything. He truly has what Tom Wolfe said about the astronauts. He truly has the right stuff. He's good-humored. He's jovial. He can take a joke. He can laugh at himself. But the cowboy's also anti-intellectual, and he's anti-school, other attitudes that appeal to pre-adolescent males. So what I'd like to suggest to you is that the popularity of the cowboy hero points to certain overlooked but important aspects of the American character. The cowboy was truly the hero of the pre-adolescent male. And for a moment, let's compare him to some other heroes. For example, the cold, serious, high-cheekboned, blonde, blue-eyed Aryan of Nazi Germany, or the tough, swaggering gangster of the 1930s, or the self-righteous, brutal superheroes of the 1940s like Superman, Batman, and Captain America. How would you compare those various kinds of heroes? Which are the most attractive? Yes?
I think basically Superman is a modern day cowboy, definitely, because he's always saving Lois Lane. Even in the serials, she would always get into trouble. She was this independent woman, she was constantly punished. She was always put in a situation where Superman would have to come and rescue her every single time.
So they're updated heroes, and yet there's something colder about Superman than about, I think, these earlier cowboy heroes. In an age of violence, when we think about the kind of heroes that Americans might have chosen, perhaps there's something positive about the cowboy hero compared to the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan of Nazi Germany. Clearly, the cowboy is preferable. Okay, we're going to look at some pictures now from the overhead projector from cowboy movies. We're going to see some pictures of how the cowboy genre evolved. Now, the first cowboy actor was a man named Bronco Billy Anderson. He made 400 silent westerns from 1903 to 1920. This is not Bronco Billy. This is a man named George Barnes, and this is from the last scene in the first real American movie to tell a story. It was called The Great Train Robbery. He fires twice into the camera and then fades into the smoke. So the first American movie to tell a story was a Western. Here, the gunfights of the OK Corral, you see Tom Mix. And here, in a 1925 film, you see the other great Western hero of the early period, a man named William S. Hart. It's not John Wayne, is it? I mean, it's a very different portrayal of the Western hero. It's truly from the movies, I think, that we all get our glimpses of the West. Here you see pioneers moving westward. It looks real. It looks like a photograph, right? But it's the movies. And this is what our glimpses of that West are made from. In a great film of 1939, you see Marlene Dietrich in Destry Rides Again. In a moment, we're going to see some scenes from Stagecoach, but there you can see John Wayne in another 1939 classic, again from Stagecoach. Also in 1939, this is from the Oklahoma Kid. One of the most famous of the Western films, this is Fort Apache. Later, Paul Newman would make a remake of it called Fort Apache the Bronx, showing again how malleable the Western is. This is, of course, the scene we saw in High Noon. An early version of Last of the Mohicans. Here you see Natty Bumppo in the center alongside Chingachgook. Another scene from a Western film. You see the villain overseeing someone he has shot. An Indian attack. From Red River, which is a psychological Freudian Western. We'll talk about what that means in a bit. In 1950, for the first time, in a film called Broken Arrow, we see Indians treated truly as tragic victims of American expansion. And so the seeds of Dances with Wolves were first planted earlier on. Again, from High Noon. Here, one of the great Westerns we're going to see a clip from in a little bit, Shane. The story of Jesse James. Westerns could become populist fables. What I mean by that is Westerns could become ways of attacking big business interests. And Jesse James was a crucial character in these, what I would call populist Westerns. 3:10 to Yuma. John Wayne again in Rio Bravo. The Spaghetti Western with Clint Eastwood, directed by an Italian director, Sergio Leone. John Wayne Older Yet. And one thing that we often forget about is that at least 20% of the cowboys were Mexican Americans, and 20% of the cowboys were African Americans. But the Westerns only rarely took advantage of this fact. This is from 1972, Buck and the Preacher, one of the few Westerns that featured a black hero. The first cowboy actor, as I said, Bronco Billy, made 400 silent Westerns. That sounds like an awful lot, but it's only a small percentage of the Westerns that were ever made. Between 1926 and 1967, 4,000 Westerns were made. That is 25% of all the movies that were made between 1926 and 1967, the sound era to 1967, a quarter were Westerns. I mean, we're just wholly unfamiliar with that world. In 1959, and I can remember this, there were 48 Western shows on television every week. 48 different shows, though I would defy anyone to try to remember even half of their names. But it's truly amazing. I mean, those of you who didn't grow up watching Westerns can't imagine how different it was not that much long before you were born. The production of Westerns has sharply fallen off, and yet twice in the 1990s, the Best Picture was won by a Western, by Dances with Wolves in 1990 and Unforgiven in 1992. And the 1995 winner, Braveheart, used all the Western formula, except with a different frontier. And so, even though the Western has really declined, there's no question that it remains a very potent cultural force. And so what I want to suggest to you is that for 3/4 of a century, the Western dominated film, and it dealt with the largest themes and issues in American history. The original sin of seizing the land from Indians, the waves of emigration westward of trappers and herders, ranchers and farmers and pioneers. It tracks the arrival of new technologies like railroads and barbed wire and improved firearms. And it explores the cultural conflict and relationship between individuals and the communities they live in. So the Western wasn't just shoot-'em-ups. It was really about these larger themes again and again and again. So for much of the past century, the Western was the dominant feature of American popular culture. And that is now forgotten because we don't see Westerns very much, but it was true until not that long ago. Our very conception of masculinity, loyal, committed to a personal code of honor, speaking softly but carrying a big stick, that comes from the cowboy hero. But of course, the real era of the cowboy was an extraordinarily brief period in American history. It lasted less than 20 years. There were real cowboys in this country between the mid-1860s and the mid-1880s, and that was it. But while other colorful episodes of our nation's past faded, the appeal of the cowboy persisted. For moments, various kinds of heroes sparked our imagination, but then they faded, but the cowboy didn't. The cowboy would live on in Pulp Fiction, in TV shows, films, and above all, in the figure of John Wayne. So what we're going to do next is we're going to see a brief scene from the film Stagecoach, which really turned John Wayne into a hero. He looks a lot different than he does in later films. He looks a little too handsome in this picture. Let's see this clip from the 1939 film Stagecoach. There he is. We can stop there. Stagecoach, which appeared in 1939, which is the greatest year ever in American film, and something we'll talk about in a succeeding class, is a sort of grand hotel on wheels. You have characters on board a stagecoach who represent every imaginable social type, adventure, romance, chivalry, and we see how they all fare when they're attacked by Indians and later by robbers. It has many of the stereotypes of later Western films all embedded in it. The prostitute with a heart of gold, etc. And it was an enormous hit, and it single-handedly revived the Western genre, I think. Now, our society's preoccupation with the Western frontier and the cowboy hero has deep cultural roots. It can trace back as far as the figures of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. The Western was also bound up with our self-definition as a country with a frontier and a country with a unique civilizing mission. That was God's country out there, or out here, since we're west of the Mississippi. We were to build a city on the hill there, a prosperous Eden where all the snakes would be driven out. Our egalitarian values, our democratic self-reliance, these would be tested on the Western frontier. The optimism of the preamble of the Constitution to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, those are the issues in virtually every Western. So the Western is truly a civics lesson, I think, though a very complicated one. Now, the Western hero is remarkably adaptable. He can be liberal or he can be conservative. He can be an enforcer of law and order, or he can be what I will call a social bandit, a Robin Hood-like figure who expresses lower-class discontent with the division of wealth and power. The Western hero can promote progress, or he can resist the process of modernization. Again, we see the flexibility of the Western. It's the same story over and over again, but with subtle differences in its themes. As I said, the very first American film to tell a story was a Western, Edwin S. Porter's Great Train Robbery of 1903. And it contained all the classic features of a Western. A sheriff, an outlaw, a bad Indian, a good Indian, a Mexican villain, a heroic outlaw, and a desperate half-breed. If the terms sound offensive, they were offensive right from the start. They were intrinsic parts of this Western narrative. And for 30 years, from Stagecoach to the Wild Bunch, from 1939 to 1969, the Western was the most consistently popular, most widely produced form of action film. It was the American genre, the dominant form of entertainment. And it was also a significant field for the creation of public myth and ideology. We had two really important films about the South. We had Birth of a Nation, and we had Gone with the Wind. And those movies were tremendously popular. But we had 4,000 movies about the American West. None of them was as influential as Gone with the Wind or Birth of a Nation. But each one was influential. And each time people saw a Western, the Western's lesson was strongly reinforced. It was firmly etched in the American imagination. So if you were to ask me what's better to have, 2 big hammer blows or 4,000 smaller ones, I think the 4,000 smaller make a bigger difference. In the Western, one saw the forces of corruption versus virtue. One saw rugged individualism versus the refinement of civilization presided over by women. One saw the struggle against a racially alien enemy. And during the 1950s in particular, the Western built national solidarity in face of the threat posed by Soviet communism. We're going to look next at 2 brief excerpts from Westerns. The first one we're going to look at is from a film that some people consider the greatest Western. It's called Shane. It appeared in 1953. It's the classic about a quiet gunfighter who defends homesteaders from a gang of thugs. If we could see that clip, please.
I've heard that you're a low-down Yankee liar.
We lose our sound.
Prove it.
Okay, if we can stop right there. Okay, this is a film that appears in 1953 at the height of McCarthyism in the United States, at the height of anti-communism. What kind of messages do you think a film like that would send to Americans who watched it? What kind of political messages does a film like that convey? No messages at all. What do you think? I mean, what is it telling Americans? How do we settle our scores? How do we settle conflicts? Peacefully, through negotiations?
No, through war.
Through violence, right? And in that struggle, is it blurry? Is there lots of moral ambiguity? There's good on both sides? Is that what that movie's telling you?
No, I mean, Shane was strictly about right versus wrong, according to...
Morality's
Right.
black and white.
Yeah.
And the hero's wearing white. It's not too hard to tell which side this is on. And in this film, what you didn't see is that you have this hero come in to protect some homesteaders who can't protect themselves. So what message is it sending? What is it saying about what America's role should be in the Cold War, please?
It's containment, the Truman policy of containment, and like Korea, later on Vietnam.
That we have to be the guardians at the gate, that you can't rely on other people to defend themselves. Okay. The next clip we're going to see is from a film in 1960. It's called The Magnificent Seven. You're not going to hear the great music, I'm afraid, from the Marlboro theme, but this is an incredibly influential film. It's a remake of a Japanese film. It's a remake of a 1954 film by Akira Kurosawa called The Seven Samurai. And yet, it's very different than The Seven Samurai. When you translate it into English, you don't just change the words, you change the whole meaning. Let's take a look at this clip, then I'll explain what's going on.
Generosity. That was my first mistake. I leave these people a little bit extra and they hire these men to make trouble. It shows you, sooner or later, you must answer for every good deed.
Stop the clip right there. A small Mexican village has hired 7 tough gunslingers to rid themselves of a villainous band of bowling bandits. Has great music that you've heard again and again in cigarette advertisements, and it has an all-star cast. But what is the message that this film is sending? Okay, it comes out in 1960. 7 Americans have been hired by a Mexican town to protect them. What kind of message is it sending?
This is like the height of the civil rights in America, so it could reflect something like that, I would suppose.
But what is it? What would you think it might say about foreign policy? Yes.
I think what it's trying to say that America needs to intervene in foreign affairs to help, because they think that these people need our help in a way.
Yes, I mean, it's an incredibly condescending look at these Mexican villagers that we find very offensive. And you need these tough, big Americans who tower over everyone else to protect them. And this film was extremely influential. It's very hard to know where lines of influence work, but it appears that this film very much influenced John Kennedy and very much shaped the way he viewed Vietnam. Contrary to the Oliver Stone depiction, Kennedy was very strongly committed to American involvement in Vietnam and was convinced that only Americans could save the Vietnamese, who would be incapable of protecting themselves. So this movie is a sort of allegory, except it comes out first. It tells us what's supposed to happen in Vietnam, that Americans are supposed to go in and they're supposed to be able to protect the innocent people who can't protect themselves. It's very, very interesting. And I would argue in a case like this that the film really influences public policy. It helps shape the way Americans think the world works, that foreigners are constantly wanting us to come in to protect them. So the Western was crucial in shaping ideology. It offered a language and a conceptual structure for defining differences between classes, races, cultures, and moral codes. And above all, it set up a model of us versus them. It pitted the rough but virtuous West against Eastern corruption. It pitted the individual proprietor against industrial monopolies. It pitted the violent culture of men against the Christian culture of women. Now, even though there are certain common themes that run through all Westerns, there are certain conventions and stereotypes, there are different kinds of Westerns that I want to mention to you briefly. One kind of Western that you see we'll call the town tamer. The town tamer. It's epitomized by High Noon. It deals with issues of crime and punishment, conformity and individualism, division and solidarity. It shows, I think, that the solution to crime ultimately requires toughness. It suggests that conformist people are weak and that you need strong individuals to enforce law. It shows that town solidarity can often be a source of weakness if the people won't stand firm against threats. A second subgenre of the Western is the epic cattle drive, or the epic building of great ranches, or the epic building of railroads, the epic Western. But these Westerns aren't just about cattle drives or railroads or ranches. They're really dealing with a deeper theme, and that is, should our country become a country of giant corporations, or should we celebrate entrepreneurial freedom and the individual entrepreneur? You can guess the answer from just the way I describe it. So these kind of Westerns are sort of celebrations of individual initiative. Third subgenre of the Western are films about the Western outlaw. These are films about Jesse James. These are films that are critiques of corporate society. They're celebrations of bank robbers. They're celebrations of outlaws because they're attacking corporate power. These are Robin Hood-like celebrations of bandits. Cavalry films are really war films placed in Western settings. They provide an opportunity to explore all the themes that war films deal with, something we'll talk about later in our course, in a Western setting. Then, too, there are films focusing on Native Americans. Films like Dances with Wolves and Broken Arrow deal with injustice. They also present Indian life as a counter to the grasping materialism of white society. Next, you have the psychological or Freudian Western, like Red River. These Westerns often have Oedipal struggles between John Wayne and his son. They offer searching views of human nature, human possibilities, and they use the West as a way to explore psychological nuances. And then you have what I call the Mexican Western, like the Magnificent Seven that we just saw, or Veracruz. These show American freedom fighters battling the forces of oppression and alien ideologies in the Third World. In these Westerns, we see mercenaries and amoral pragmatists who will break any rule to achieve their goal. And they teach us that you don't win by playing fair. You win by doing anything necessary to win. Probably a bad lesson to learn right before the Vietnam War. So let me ask you a question. Is the Western genre inherently sexist, racist, and violent. Is that what it is in its core? What should we think about this genre? Again, I've tried to stress to you that Westerns aren't just entertainment, right? They send powerful ideological messages. And so I think we have to face up to the question straightforwardly. Was the Western inherently racist, sexist, and violent? What do you think?
I think absolutely it was, but I'm not sure that the filmmakers, that was their goal, to make people change their minds about stuff, because our minds were already in that mindset.
Very interesting. What do others think? What do you think?
Yes, and part of the reason behind that is the people who colonized the frontier were veterans of the Civil War. They were bitter, violent, and angry people who, and it was hard drinking and easy gunslinging days.
What do others think? Could you make a non-racist, non-sexist, non-violent Western?
I think you can, but you wouldn't sell tickets at the box office.
What do others think? I mean, this is a genre that has really declined. It's declined within your own lifetime. And no doubt one of the reasons it's declined is because Westerns aren't too PC. And yet the real West was a land of incredible multiculturalism. Without any doubt, the real West was the most multicultural part of the country. You don't see that in these films. But in fact, you have a tremendous diversity of peoples. And at least in theory, you could make incredible Westerns highlighting Mexican Americans, African Americans, Native Americans. I mean, if one thought hard about it and you wouldn't even have to read that much Western history. You could create quite different Westerns than the Westerns we produced. Does that mean the Western will return as a genre, as new groups tap into it? I see no, but why no? What do you think? Why won't the Western return, in your view?
I guess it's just a fading story in our past. I mean, it's not interesting and
archaic, extinct like the dodo bird. What do you think?
Well, if that was the case, that the West was culturally diverse, then I would say that the Western isn't inherently racist and sexist and violent. That's just the way it developed because we dictated to them what we wanted to see, our idealistic view of it. So it could return with new morals now, if people started producing them the way it actually occurred.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that in the 90s, twice, Westerns were very, very successful. Dances with Wolves and Unforgiven. Clearly, there is something still alive in the genre, though I think in general it is a fading genre. Did you want to say something, please?
I think it's been replaced with a new medium of Mario Puzo's writings and Brian De Palma films about the 1920s.
Well, we're gonna talk more about that in just a bit as we talk about new mythologies that are shaping the American identity. A key message in most Westerns was that violence was an essential and necessary part of the process through which America was established and through which democratic values were defended and enforced. So violence, I suspect, is pretty close to the core of Westerns. It's not just an artificial add-on. So why do you think the Western declined? We've already mentioned that the Western seemed to run counter to many values that people feel today. But why else has the Western declined? Why don't we see a lot of Westerns anymore? How come there's no Westerns on anything but cable channels these days? Why? Where did it go? If Steven Spielberg was raised on Westerns, how come he doesn't make them? What's wrong? Okay. I think, first of all, the Vietnam War undermined the Western's themes. The Vietnam War was a shattering experience for American society. not because it was evil from the start, but because the war reflected traditional American idealism. That is, the Vietnam War was undertaken for what appeared to be noble reasons, the same kind of reasons we saw in our clip from the Magnificent Seven. It was justified using all the same arguments that had been used to justify sending the cavalry into Arizona or Texas. That is, to allow people to have a civilized way of life without outside threats. And what the Vietnam War revealed is that that justification didn't always work, that justification could itself lead to brutality and immoralities that Americans had never suspected. With Vietnam and 7 years of protest, this myth that America intervenes to make other people's lives better, that looked like the rankest hypocrisy. When 2 million Vietnamese die in war supposedly fought for their benefit, then people begin to wonder, what is the meaning of this ideology? And so a newer generation wanted nothing of that traditional Western ideology. The Western morality tale was replaced by the end of the West Western. These were films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or Little Big Man, or McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or The Wild Bunch. These were the end of the West, and the story is a story of tragedy. The films show that a military-industrial complex, in this case the railroads, has taken over the West and thwarts individual freedom, and thwarts individual initiative, and it always ends in the tragic death of the hero or heroes. McCabe and Mrs. Miller is High Noon turned upside down and inside out. It retells the story of the United States in terms of the frontier myth, but with a bitter message. It begins with the founding of the town of Presbyterian Church in high hopes, right? Americans were going to build a city on a hill. They were going to create a religious community in the wilderness. But it ends with cop-out hopelessness and drugs and tragedy. And so it's a metaphor for the American dream turned upside down. And in this film, it's the hero who is shot and killed. It's the reverse of High Noon. So one reason why the Western has declined is simply that the myth that the Western conveyed has lost its resonances with Americans. And the second reason that the Western has declined is that audiences no longer are attuned to the plots and the iconography of the Western. Now, what do I mean by all that? There was a time when the images of a land as big as the heart of the men who tamed it sent shivers through people's spines. People would see Monument Valley and they said, that's America. Or they would see scenes of Mexico and they'd say, that's America. But this Wild West, this untamed wilderness, resonated with people who'd never lived outside of Brooklyn. That was the real America. And the vision of the men who tamed the West, of the lone outcasts on horseback, these stories, these were deeply meaningful to Americans because metaphorically people identified with them. The third reason that the Western has declined is because of its stereotypical representations of people of color. Native Americans, Latinos, Asians are all portrayed generally in very infuriating and abhorrent manners. And further, Westerns are the ultimate boy toy. They don't even have Sharon Stone in them, right? They're irredeemably masculinist. And to go a bit further, Westerns appear to legitimate imperialism and colonialism. They're all about conquest. They're all about taking over land that belonged to other people. And it's about celebrating that conquest. And we no longer feel very easy with that message. And further, Westerns are filled with cliches. They seem to be racist, sexist, and violent to their core. Another problem with the Western has to do with pacing. Westerns are slow, though people who liked Westerns never viewed them as slow. Westerns are filled with long silences. They're filled with panoramic shots of the Western landscape. And audiences loved these epic visions. And audiences today don't. We're bred on MTV. We're bred on commercials. We're bred on fast action cuts. And we can't stand the slow pacing of Westerns. But that was an intrinsic part of the Western. I mean, they were epic in scale and they were epic in length, and we find it awfully hard to sit through movies that are 3 hours and 15 minutes long. Audiences today think of Westerns in terms of slow-moving plots, flat, barren, visually unappealing landscapes that swallow up the action, but that's just what attracted people to them earlier in time. But I'd like to suggest that something deeper is going on. For nearly 100 years, the Western was the archetypical American narrative. It was the archetypical American morality play. It was absolutely central to the way Americans understood our history, our politics, our race relations, even our literature. In other words, Westerns spoke to American dreams. Westerns spoke of who we are. Today, however, not many Americans, not even many Texans, see themselves as the inheritors of a national destiny. We no longer mourn the passing of the Old West. We no longer mourn the passing of Western values. Not a single person in our room has on boots. We just don't think of ourselves quite the same way. Even though the Western was always a minority experience, pioneering was central to our self-image as a people. And even if your people pioneered from Lithuania or Sicily or Poland, you still thought of yourself as a pioneer. And you could think of the Western as telling your story. Migration, the quest for new and better things, served as a metaphor for the experience of mobility and displacement that belonged to all Americans. All of us felt displaced. All of us felt as if we had come from some homeland and ended up in some dislocated environment. So whether you were a foreign immigrant or you were native-born, you could identify with the Western story. And it was very helpful for immigrants because in the West, there were no ethnic groups, right? In the West, all you saw were, quote-unquote, Americans. So the Western symbolized authentic Americanism, something that ethnic immigrants were longing for. This is before, of course, the development of our appreciation of multiculturalism. It was probably also helpful for the Western's popularity that it showed a society divided into two polar elements. You were either white or you were alien. And so if you were in the audience and you were white, it was easy to identify with the cowboy hero because you knew you were us and somebody else was them. And so the Western, I think, was very important in helping to create a unified national identity, a sense of ourselves as a common people. Further, the Western hero seemed like an individualist at a time when our society was becoming more bureaucratic. Americans had not yet accepted, as we do, the reality that we live in a totally urban, bureaucratic society where we're just a cog in a larger machine. Americans were still eager to see that heavily individualistic hero, and that's what the Western gave you every time you saw it. Someone who was not tied down by bureaucratic order, someone who is not restricted by all the barriers of modern society. And so what I'd argue to you is that we have developed a new mythic hero, one that speaks more directly to us today than the Western hero and has really become our substitute for the Western hero, and that is the gangster. Gangster films speak to us in a way that Western films used to, but no longer do, and in a way that no other films do. I find it intriguing that Italian Americans who experienced enormous amounts of prejudice in the 20th century, who experienced enormous amounts of discrimination, have in many ways become the ideal Americans, at least in the movies. What would explain the attraction of Italian American culture to Americans who are not Italian American? Why are so many of our films today dealing with Italian American life? Not as it really is, but through the fantasies of these gangster films or The Godfather. What do you think the attraction of that is? Strong family ties, strong ethnic identity, strong religious sentiments. Those Americans who have none of that can still feel that that's a real loss. And so it's very intriguing to me how the Italian American, that is John Travolta, has become everyman in some way. That we can identify with him in a way people used to identify with John Wayne or Tom Mix or other Western heroes. So what is the appeal? I think it also goes deeper than just the appeal of ethnicity and ethnic identity. It also reflects our growing sense that despite years of economic growth, we live in a chronically dysfunctional society, a society deeply riddled by violence, a society that seems to be reverting to savagery. And the gangster film both explains how that happened and shows you that the only way to protect yourself is with other forms of violence. In other words, its message is not entirely dissimilar from the message of the Western. But maybe the Western never did die. Maybe the Western just was transformed. Maybe the Western still exists and still triumphs our imagination, but it's no longer projected on Texas and Kansas and the Great Plains. Maybe it's just been projected onto other environments. And that is the last argument that I want to make to you today. That the Western still remains our dominant metaphor, except Westerns now take place in cities, they've become urbans, or they take place in outer space. Star Wars is nothing but an updated Western. It is still a shoot 'em up. It still has its horses, except they're now spaceships. It is a Western, but now in an environment that seems more believable to us than does the Old West. We still fight aliens. Heroes still try to tame violence using violence. We still seek to make a violent environment peaceful by using force, except now it's laser guns instead of six-shooters. We're still trying to make the West a safe place for families to live, except now the West is out there, not down here. So if the Western film has fallen on hard times, we still wear blue jeans, and we still listen to country and Western music, and we still go to the rodeo. So I think as much as has changed, as much has been transformed, the Western still remains the basic archetype in the American imagination. And if you want to see the violence, sexism, and other nasty characteristics of the Western, you don't go to Westerns anymore. You go to the Star Wars movies, and you see them all played out in a new environment. That's enough for today.